If you're new in town or just new to this whole podcast thing, you're tuning in to Lore by Night, the podcast that discusses all things vampiric with no fear of breaching the Masquerade. In this episode, we shall review Necropolis Atlanta, a sourcebook for Wraith the Oblivion and Vampire the Masquerade. I shall present my thoughts and opinion on its presentation and mechanics to help you better decide whether this is the sourcebook for you. By definition, the world of darkness is a dark place to live, but then again, so is the actual world it was based upon. Throughout history, the human race has produced some truly despicable people and groups. Creatives and their media attempt to keep those stories alive to educate the next generation not to repeat said mistakes of those who've come before them. White Wolf Publishing are amongst said individuals, and I think it is fair to say that their attempts at including real-world events and people in their games are consistently inconsistent. So, when I say that the focus of tonight's episode, Necropolis Atlanta, regards itself with the US Confederates, slavery and the KKK, chances are it has caused shivers to run down your spine as you wince at the dread at how badly White Wolf fucked this up. I should know, for I was one of them, but then I did what a lot of World of Darkness fans aren't bothered to do. I read the book, and I'm prepared to argue that this book is far more relevant now than it was in 1994, the year of the book's release. Quite the bold claim, I know, but before we get onto that, here are the rules for the Lore by Night book reviews. I shall explore snippets of the lore, mechanics and rules found within the tome. I'll look as to how they're presented and easily they're conveyed to new and old players alike. As this is a review written and presented by me, all thoughts and opinions are my own, so if you disagree with something I've said, that is totally fine. It does not mean that you're right and I'm wrong and vice versa. A good place to start with anything is at the beginning, which has a start of the physical book itself, which currently sits nicely upon my lap. It is a letter-sized, soft cover book with a nice, smooth, glossy cover, just like a lot of original print White Wolf books are. Dominating the front and back covers are the signature blue Wraith chains, binding those within the realms of the Shadowlands. On the front is the famous art piece by Brom that would influence the Deadlands RPG, which I am told is not a Wraith, as one would have you believe, but a vampire, adorned in Confederate regalia, holding a sword and gun in each hand, in front of a war-torn Confederate flag, against a very industrial backdrop, all with a fairly modern hairstyle and ear piercings, at least it was modern for the mid-90s. It's a very imposing front cover, certainly one of the more attention-grabbing of the White Wolf covers to date, whilst being the clearest about the sort of setting this sourcebook will have. I do have to say that learning that the figure is a vampire and not a Wraith was somewhat disappointing, that I couldn't just have one fucking Wraith book without the infection and VTM, but I suppose it should have been obvious given the crossed arms and white skin. And there was me thinking it was a not so subtle political message. Silly me. The book's interior is very much your standard Wraith the Oblivion affair. The page's black and white borders have the grotesquely hypnotic glyphs and illustrations of John Cobb and various character portraits by Joshua Timbrook, both staples of classic World of Darkness, particularly the former regarding Wraith. Timbrook's portraits feel a bit more appropriate with the ghoulish, stuck-in-time characters that populate Wraith the Oblivion than they would do in Vampire the Masquerade, as there is a certain charm to them here that I can't quite put my finger on. Some of the other art pieces borderline the impressionistic style, as if the spirits are lost to the vortexes of the Tempest, while others are more photorealistic, the latter located at the beginning of each chapter, and these are done by Daryl Elliott. Together, it all paints a grim picture of the Shadowlands of Atlanta, those who wish to be remembered, those who you only hear and described to you, and those who would rather be or soon be forgotten. The final, remotely artistic piece I wish to cover is the two maps that are located in the geography chapter, which are quite frankly a little shit, as the black text is difficult to read on the highly detailed black, grey and white map. This book does not start with your typical ghost story fiction, so it's straight into the introductory chapter itself, which details what it aims to cover and what you'll find inside. Obviously, it makes it clear that this book should provide an overview of Atlanta, so anyone could run a game of Wraith the Oblivion, Vampire the Masquerade, or cross-game of the two within the capital of Georgia. As a necropolis, it is a city of the dead filled with a cyclical transformation, as fires periodically sweep through, releasing tension and renewing the city. However, Atlanta remains haunted by its tumultuous past, with a palpable passion and rage shaped by decades of unrest. This passion defines the city, evoking a southern Gothic atmosphere where the fragrant magnolia blossoms contrast with the decayed grandeur of slums and historic estates. Atlanta embodies a sense of crumbling splendor and nostalgia for a bygone golden age, setting it apart from the most modern American cities. At least in principle, but that's the cynic within me speaking. Now, this may seem an odd way to describe a city within the world of darkness, with such, dare I say, uplighting, optimistic descriptors, and the book acknowledges this, highlighting the darkness is more subtle, harbouring a more we don't talk about those things vibe, pretending it didn't happen, or worse still, ignoring that these are not only a cancer on the city's development and history and current political climate. I am of course talking about the white supremacy, not just in the book's the inclusion of the KKK and the white supremacist renegade faction, the Sons of the Imperial Dragons, but also how the Western world continues to benefit from more subtle acts of discrimination and equality, themes the chapter highlights and challenges enough to make the predominantly white male audience aware that others have it worse than them, which continues within the underworld as plenty of wraiths make up individuals of the Bush of Ghosts, Dark Kingdom of Ivory. Even without the box that mentions the authors decided not to ignore this element of Atlanta's history, placed next to a quarter-page illustration of half the face of a Ku Klux Klan member, is something that should be applauded. Taking a step back for a moment, the chapter concludes with a more general outlook of Atlanta, the services, media, culture, and travel in the metropolis, all culminating in a Shroud rating of a whopping 9 or 10. Wowzers! Chapter 2 is about the history of Atlanta, specifically from the perspective of the Wraiths. As this is America, its history begins with the white Western tradition of colonization, slavery, and genocide, so it's a particularly dark chapter. There's obviously a lot to cover in this chapter, and the authors do not hesitate to shy away from the atrocities, addressing it factually from the get-go, much to the chapter's detriment, as not only is it quite a bit to read, but these history chapters can be a bit dry and a bit on the heavy side, but it is important to look and challenge a recurring theme in this book, no less. So, to summarise as briefly as I can, European colonization disrupted the spiritual balance, thickening the Shroud and enabling Oblivion's spread. The hierarchy followed, establishing citadels across the Americas, including the area now known as Atlanta. Spectres, fueled by Malthian's energies, emerged alongside this expansion, their corruption linked to the colonists' rapid industrialization. The Trial of Tears and the forced removal of the Cherokee in 1838 saw thousands of souls consumed by anger, many becoming agents of Oblivion. As railroads developed, Atlanta became a major necropolis. The Civil War brought immense bloodshed, turning the city's Shadowlands into a chaotic battlefield. Renegade groups like the Sons of the Imperial Dragons and heretic railroaders emerged, clashing with the hierarchy. Spectres exploited the devastation, causing the widespread destruction events during the Sherman's burning of Atlanta, which created a maelstrom that shattered both the city and its Shadowlands. The conflict saw the rise of the Grey Boys, restless Confederate and Union soldiers, as well as tensions between Stygia and the Ivory Kingdom over the souls of African-descended wraiths. By the 20th century, Atlanta's Shadowlands thrived on the memoriam from its cultural significance, but remained turbulent. The Fifth Great Maelstrom in 1945 devastated the necropolis, with firestorms and spectres ravaging the city. Racial tensions escalated after Martin Luther King's assassination in 1968. Wraith factions clashed violently. The oppressive hierarchy suppressed heretics and destroyed sacred sites, but whispers of a Child of the Phoenix prophecy emerged, foretelling ever renewal or destruction. Now, on the eve of the 1996 Olympics, Atlanta's Shadowlands stand at a crossroads. Rumours of a great council involving emissaries from the other Deadlands signals a potential shift in power, with the city's fate hanging between war, prophecy, and survival. Obviously, we do not know the outcome of this, but one could make their own creative decisions in games today in the 21st century, even if it means ignore it entirely if you don't think it is worth exploring for whatever reason. This leads me to the geography chapter, the third chapter of the book, which I think is my favourite chapter in the book, purely because it is the only real case study storytellers I have on making it Necropolis or some other undead territory for your cast of Wraith players. Being a city ruled by the hierarchy, there is information about how the legions keep tabs on everyone, preventing them from leaving willy-nilly and breaking the codes of Charon, even highlighting basic patrol patterns. Various hotspots and landmarks are presented and how different Wraiths control and behave, some of these being mechanical haunts, which can be places for Wraith players to have their own haunts or inspiration for haunts of their own creation. It is also appreciated that the difference between a capital H haunt and a little h haunt is explained for those who don't possess the sourcebook of the same name. Haunts. I suppose if I have to have one tiny complaint about this chapter is that I think it would have been slightly better suited after the first chapter or a part of it, as that ended talking about the overview of Atlanta whilst the next chapter would hone in on that more. I also fear it would have been slightly easier to read as it is closer to the front cover than the history chapter. With the city padded out with history, places to crash, chill and cause mayhem, it's now time to fill it with some NPCs, and this book has plenty of them, spread across 4 chapters, each one focusing on the hierarchy, heretics, renegades and others, consisting of wraiths of other dark kingdoms and souls not affiliated with any given faction, and they follow a similar presentation. A few paragraphs present the faction as a whole, with some getting more variety than others, with the hierarchy getting the largest overview by far, and the outsider the smallest. In the case of the hierarchy and the renegades, their overall influence in Atlanta is described before presenting a smaller paragraph or 2 about said faction with the larger group, so the legions of the hierarchy and the different gangs in the renegade. Each character is also presented with a character sheet, a description of their image that can and often disagrees with their actual portrait, in addition to role-playing hints addressing the reader in the second person, as it is likely to be the ST that will be role-playing them. Probably. I'm not going to go through them all, as that would be pointlessly silly, but I do want to talk about each chapter in brief. The largest of these chapters is Chapter 4, the hierarchy, which makes sense given the number of legions it has to touch base with. It is also worth noting the hierarchy of Atlanta are corrupt, working with different renegades gangs, most notably the Sons of the Imperial Dragons, the white supremacists of Atlanta's Shadowlands, with some of its Anacreons being secret members of the renegade gang, or at least in some form of the KKK. Others are against this, but due to the strength of the fascists within and the Anacreons, it is difficult to dislodge their throne, as it were. One of these figures is the Necropolis Governor James Johnson, the first NPC introduced in this book. The governor here is supposed to rule over the Anacreons, but alas, the heretics and renegades run rampant around him. Another is the Anacreon of the Legion of Paupers, a former slave called Sue, who, despite her upbringing and beliefs, believes the hierarchy is the best choice for Wraith society for some reason. I suppose it allows her to foster a proper relationship with the Kingdom of Ivory, I guess. On the flip side, the Anacreon of the Iron Legion is very much in favour of slavery and is a paedophile to boot, which is no one suspected because of the charity work he did. Haven't we all heard that one before? There are other hierarchy characters that aren't the Anacreons, of course, such as the hopeless Mary Harris, who's just one upset away from a harrowing, and Mark Creed, whose personality is just stereotypical ableist writing. The Heretics chapter have a different feel, each one revering the Christian faith in very different ways, each one also punishing those differently too, some more hostile than others. Unlike the Hierarchy chapter before it, part of the write-up of each heretic faction has a dedicated portion to what players would expect joining them, and there are a lot of factions presented with the heretics here, almost too many in my opinion, which makes them all feel a little undercooked. The most interesting of these chapters is the Renegade one, as much of the book has really revolved around the gangs that, in one way or another, rule Atlanta. Some are independent of any gang as well, but the Renegades are defined by their loathing of the hierarchy after all. The faction this review will focus primarily on is, of course, the Sons of the Imperial Dragon, which includes only 3 official members for us to explore in the book. This is clearly very deliberate and makes the point that fascism and racism are learnt inherited traits, not ones we are born with. The first is Albert Watts, who only acted in a politically correct way because that was what his wife expected of him, when he and his wife were mugged by a group of Hispanic thieves, leading to his death when he tried to save her. The mask he put on disappeared, and he joined the Sons when approached, his hatred fueling him. Keith Forsyth grew up in a rural white community that all hated black people, following a family tradition of becoming a member of the KKK, and was killed in prison for angering the wrong black guy, Jude Henderson, a member of the Shattered Chains who hates white people. Finally, there is Vad Weidemann, who blames black people for his own selfish and envious wrongdoings, and only joins the Dragon Sons because, and I quote, they accept him and they skewed his views of the events that led to his death. This trio of characters demonstrates how deeply personal grievances, societal conditioning, and twisted narratives can coalesce into a dangerous ideology, painting a chilling picture of how hatred and bigotry take root. Albert White exemplifies how a veneer of political correctness can mask deep-seated prejudices, only to have them surface when faced with tragedy. His story highlights the fragility of learned tolerance when it is not genuinely internalized. Key Forsyth, on the other hand, reveals how systematic racism and generational hatred are perpetuated through insular communities, where bigotry becomes a rite of passage rather than a conscious choice. His ultimate fate underscores the destructive cycle of violence that such ideologies perpetuate. Vad Weidemann's journey is perhaps the most tragic, as his hatred stems from a refusal to take responsibility for his own failures, instead blaming others to justify his bitterness. Together, these characters reflect their ways in which personal failings and societal pressures can merge into toxic ideologies, illustrating how fascism and racism are not innate but are cultivated through environment, fear, and unchecked anger. The last proper chapter of this book is titled The Outsiders, which focuses on Wraiths from those of the Jade, Ivory, and Obsidian Kingdoms, one of which contains a kinfolk character that has all the eye-rolling stereotypical writing you would expect from White Wolf, but you can check that out for yourself. Amongst the Outsiders chapter are some Wraiths who really don't see eye to eye with any of the factions in Stygia, which I think is an interesting point to note. If we compare similar sections to Vampire the Masquerade City by Night books, these individuals are usually old and powerful, beyond the reach of most player characters. Players of that game are usually confined to one of these available three, often two sects, but not with Wraith the Oblivion. It is a very freeing feeling in this sense. On the topic of Vampire, the book ends with a reasonably sized appendix of 2 parts. The second part is a page-long errata to Wraith the Oblivion First Edition, whilst the vast majority of it is Atlanta by Night, which has additional information about how the Camarilla rules the city and some kindred to populate it with, as well as an incredibly lackluster crossplay section. If you want to know exactly what Atlanta by Night entails, I guess you're just going to have to read the Necropolis Atlanta book itself, and read it you should, as I think I have made it very clear just how politically important a tome like this is 31 years after its release. Look to the pigs in office in America, the orange man who now rules the US of A, as this episode goes live, and how every space online is filled with these racist bigots rather than the small, self-contained spaces that we like to pretend don't exist or laugh and point at them when the moles would poke their heads up. We laugh and jest, not believing the corrupt politicians who lie and cheat their way into power, using their hatred as a mantra to win over the poor and vulnerable, offering family when reality really meant that all they wanted was a war against anything that wasn't fucking white. This review, and indeed the purchasing of this book in the physical form, came about a post on Instagram published on the 6th of April 2024 that dismissed this book as edgy because of its content and the front cover being unacceptable. That made me think that the user didn't actually read the book but just entered reactionary commentary mode to find outrage, shutting down all means of conversation regarding the themes and book, actually identifying what it is trying to warn and tell people. Again, I understand that many people are quick to shut down more mature ideas from the mature game company who have at times dealt with things very immaturely. They probably saw the KKK faction and assumed they are meant to be playable but didn't bother reading it, and if they did, they approached all of it with a bias. Having read the book numerous times myself in PDF and physical form, if it does not exist, unlike the other factions presented, it is very clear throughout this book that these are villains to fight against, to shut down and show them their place, but most people who see and know this have rammed their fingers in their ears and pretend that none of it exists. To not include the evils of a particular city or country when writing a historical piece is not only dishonest, but a shameful whitewashing of events, the inverse of what you would usually find with people who deny the atrocities and hate crimes committed by these people. And White Wolf does not condone these actions of the writing in this book via the mature content warning box on page fucking 8. 8. Just because White Wolf doesn't present a 3-page thesis analysing the evil out of character or coming across as extremely apologetic, hating their own work and writing, does not mean they poorly handled their topics at face value. Necropolis Atlanta, I feel, is a fantastic sourcebook for Wraith the Oblivion characters and, to an extent, Vampire the Masquerade ones to populate their fictional interpretation. It is dark and unapologetically honest about what happened in the Skinlands and how that could carry over into the Shadowlands, where hatred sinks and festers within the soul, especially when they are now brothers and sisters in arms with like-minded people in the hundreds, possibly thousands. The World of Darkness games are dark, and Necropolis Atlanta is amongst the most harrowing and uncomfortable of them, bringing some of the themes that exist as Wraith the Oblivion's underbelly and bringing them to the surface, forcing the players to confront them head-on and make a stand or keep quiet and let hatred win. Now, I can understand how playing in a setting so bleak and harrowingly relatable is not for everyone, as TTRPGs often provide an escape from the harshness of reality. However, TTRPGs, like the rest of fiction, can help provide lessons and opportunities we wouldn't get otherwise, even is the lesser emotion of punching a member of the KKK in the face. We have, however, gone beyond such crass, cartoonish ideas, as these people are right in our faces right now. If you don't like to play in a setting like that, that is fine, but don't dismiss something as something else because you are afraid of challenging looking past your own biases. And for those of you who are new to the Lore by Night brand and the reviews I occasionally do, I do not do out of 10 scores because they are subjectively pointless. One person's 10 out of 10 is another's 3 out of 5 stars, which is another's minus 42 out of 100, so I shall rate this book Rudyard Kipling out of 10, as that is just as helpful as a proper out of 10 score. To be kept updated, follow the Lore by Night VTM Instagram and Blue Sky pages to find out when we upload each episode. You can also find out by subscribing to the YouTube channel and clicking on the little bell, as you'll be immediately notified when the latest episode is live. Until next time, farewell.